Victor Gideon isn't just another Resident Evil villain. He's the result of 30 years of failure, cover-ups, and unfinished experiments that started back in 1998. If you enjoy deep Resident Evil lore, villain breakdowns, and more, consider subscribing. It really helps the channel. This video breaks down who Victor Gideon really is, why he did what he did, and why he may be the most unsettling antagonist the series has ever created. Before we get into the video, I just want to say thank you for the support on this new channel. To give something back, I'm doing a small giveaway. On release day, February 27th, 2026, I'll be giving away a Resident Evil 9 game code or store voucher. To enter, just comment Resident Evil 9 below. I'll put all the names into a wheel spin and announce the winner on the 27th. And yes, your name can be entered more than once across different videos. Just keep it to one comment per video. Part 1. Who is Victor Gideon? The basics. The profile of Victor Gideon in the Resident Evil Requiem archives reveals a man who is the antithesis of the theatrical, mad scientist archetype that defined the early era of the Umbrella Corporation. Gideon does not seek the spotlight, nor does he operate with the overt ego of a William Birkin or an Albert Wesker. Instead, Victor Gideon is a high-tier logistics and cleanup expert. He is a ghost in the global security system, a man who spent decades erasing evidence of biological crimes before deciding that the only way to truly clean the world was to finish what Umbrella started in the Arklay region 30 years ago. He is a clinical strategist who views the human species as a data set to be managed rather than a population to be saved. His background is not in the laboratory, but in the boardroom and the tactical command center, making him one of the most dangerous individuals to ever emerge from the wreckage of the Umbrella Empire. Gideon vanished from the international radar shortly after the 2003 Raccoon City trials. While other Umbrella executives were facing prosecution or fleeing to offshore havens, Gideon was utilizing his deep knowledge of the company's black budget infrastructure to disappear. He understood that the legal collapse of Umbrella was merely a rebranding opportunity. For 20 years, he has operated in the shadows of the global bioweapon market, acting as a fixer for various shadow syndicates and government factions. He is a man who knows where the bodies are buried, because he is the one who wrote the protocols for their disposal. In Resident Evil Requiem, he has resurfaced not as an employee, but as an architect. He has moved beyond the profit motives of his former employers and has adopted a cold, ideological mission to impose perfect order on a world he views as biologically and socially chaotic. The clinical reality of Victor Gideon is his administrative horror. He does not interact with the protagonist, Grace Ashcroft, as a monster in a basement, but as a manager overseeing a facility. He speaks through the intercoms of the Wrenwood Hotel with a calm, professional tone that is far more terrifying than any guttural roar. He treats the biological organic weapons in his facility as operational assets and the human survivors as unprocessed material. This lack of empathy is not born of madness, but of a purely logical worldview that sees the individual as a temporary unit of biomass. He is the personification of institutional evil, a man who can sign a death warrant as easily as a supply invoice. He represents the evolution of the Resident Evil villain from the gothic to the corporate to the ideological. Furthermore, Gideon's status as a ghost makes him nearly impossible for the BSAA or the DSO to track through traditional means. He utilizes a web of shell companies and redacted digital footprints to hide his activities at the Rhodes Hill facility. He understands the language of the system and uses it to his advantage, ensuring that his experiments are protected by the very laws designed to prevent them. To Victor Gideon, the world is a giant logistics problem that can only be solved through the application of a controlled outbreak. He believes that the original sin of 1998 was not the virus itself, but the failure to manage its deployment. His mission in the year 2028 is to perform a surgical correction of history, and he views Grace Ashcroft and Leon Kennedy as the final variables in his equation. Part 2. Gideon's Umbrella Corporation Ties. To understand the threat posed by Victor Gideon in Resident Evil Requiem, one must perform a clinical audit of his history within the Umbrella Corporation. Gideon was never a celebrity researcher like the Ashford family or the Birkins. Instead, he served as a high-tier monitor for Umbrella's European branch. His specific job description involved the management of information containment and risk mitigation. He was the man responsible for ensuring that localized outbreaks or biological accidents did not interfere with the company's global stock value or legal standing. He was a strategist who operated at a level of abstraction that allowed him to view the T-virus and its derivatives not as weapons of war, but as demographic filters. He viewed the human population through the lens of genetic utility, believing that the weak elements of society were an inefficiency that the virus could eventually prune. Gideon's perspective on the collapse of Umbrella in 2003 is one of profound contempt for the leadership of Oswell Spencer. He did not view the company's bankruptcy as a failure of the biological science, but as a failure of management and discipline. He believed that Umbrella's downfall was caused by the theatrical egos of its primary researchers and the lack of a central, logical directive, while Spencer was obsessed with godhood and immortality. Gideon was obsessed with governance and logistics. After the Caucasus facility raid and the subsequent legal trials, Gideon took his files and his cleanup protocols and went underground. He realized that Umbrella had created the perfect tool in the progenitor virus, but they were too blinded by their own hubris to use it effectively. He viewed himself as the true successor to the Umbrella legacy, the only one with the administrative courage to finish the work. The clinical reality of Gideon's ties to the company is seen in his professional distance from the horrors he facilitates. He was never the one in the lab coat injecting the subjects. He was the one in the tailored suit, signing the waste disposal forms and authorizing the sterilization strategies. This background has given him a unique advantage in the modern era. He understands how to navigate the redacted infrastructure of the post-Umbrella world. He knows which government officials are compromised and which laboratories are still holding secret samples from the 1990s. He is a librarian of the apocalypse, a man who has successfully bridged the gap between the analog secrets of the Spencer era and the digital conspiracies of the 2028 world. He is the ghost of Umbrella that refuses to be exorcised because he is the one who wrote the exorcism protocols. Furthermore, Gideon's role as a monitor gave him access to the lost records of the Raccoon City Police Department. He understood that the data generated during the 1998 incident was the most valuable asset in the world, far more precious than any single vial of virus. He spent years extracting that data from the ruins and refiling it under new, untraceable designations. This makes him the architect of the cover-up. He believes that by controlling the information, he controls the biological reality of the planet. Gideon does not want to evolve into a monster. He wants to manage a world of monsters from a secure command center. His ties to Umbrella are the foundation of his power, providing him with the clinical blueprints for a new world order that is based on the perfect order of a controlled, compliant population. Part 3. The Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center purchase. Immediately following the official bankruptcy of the Umbrella Corporation in the year 2003, Victor Gideon executed a series of complex financial maneuvers to secure his future. Using a web of laundered assets and black-budget shell companies, he purchased the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center. This facility, located in the isolated outskirts of the Arklay region, was ostensibly a legitimate medical center designed to treat Raccoon City trauma and other chronic conditions associated with the biological disasters of the late 1990s. To the public and to the international regulatory bodies, Rhodes Hill appeared to be a philanthropic effort to provide long-term care for the forgotten victims of the Umbrella era. In reality, Gideon had purchased himself a private, sovereign laboratory where he could continue Umbrella's work without any external oversight or ethical constraint. The Rhodes Hill facility became Gideon's primary site for post-outbreak research. For 15 years, he utilized the patients, many of whom were actual Raccoon City survivors with no remaining family, as living data logs. He spent this time testing the long-term effects of viral residue and secondary infection on the human nervous system. He was not looking for a cure. He was looking for the persistence rate of the pathogens. He wanted to know how a virus could be refined to stay dormant in a host for decades before being triggered by a specific environmental or digital signal. This research was the foundational work that would eventually lead to the development of the ELPIS project. Rhodes Hill was a purgatory where the survivors of the past were used to engineer the extinction of the future, all under the guise of chronic care. The clinical reality of Rhodes Hill was its institutional cruelty. Gideon treated the facility as a closed-loop system where human waste was recycled into research data. The basement levels were converted into high-tier containment cells, where the unfit test subjects were monitored as they mutated into failed shells. Because Gideon possessed total administrative control, he could redact the deaths of patients as natural failures or complications of trauma. He turned the concept of a hospital into a delivery system for a slow-motion apocalypse. The sorrow of Rhodes Hill is found in the fact that the people who went there for help were the very ones who were used to finalize the sterilization strategy. Gideon viewed their suffering as a reasonable operational expense in his quest for perfect order. Furthermore, the purchase of Rhodes Hill in 2003 allowed Gideon to sit and wait while the rest of the world fought over the remaining Umbrella assets. He understood that the market for bioweapons would eventually move away from the chaotic T-virus and toward a more professional category of control. By holding a fixed position in the Arklay region, he remained close to the source code of the original pathogens. He spent the years between 2003 and 2018 refining his ideology and his science in total silence. Rhodes Hill was the womb of the ELPIS project, a place where the clinical logic of the Monitor branch was allowed to fester into a planetary-scale conspiracy. When Grace Ashcroft arrives at the facility in Resident Evil Requiem, she is entering a graveyard that has been active for a quarter of a century, a monument to Gideon's patience and his absolute lack of human empathy. Part 4. Why Gideon Murdered Alyssa Ashcroft. The murder of Alyssa Ashcroft in the year 2018 was the event that set the narrative of Resident Evil Requiem into motion, and it serves as a clinical demonstration of Victor Gideon's operational logic. Alyssa, the legendary investigative reporter who survived the original Raccoon City incident, had spent years following a cold paper trail that linked the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center to the lost records of the RPD. She had discovered evidence that Gideon was not treating survivors, but harvesting them. Her investigation was on the verge of exposing the facility and its connection to the shadow factions within the government. Gideon, ever the strategist, realized that a Raccoon City survivor, with Alyssa's public platform and investigative tenacity, was a high-level risk that could not be managed through digital erasure alone. Gideon murdered Alyssa Ashcroft not out of a sense of malice or theatrical villainy, but out of operational necessity. To him, her life was a variable that threatened the stability of the Elpis project. He executed the act with a cold, professional precision that is characteristic of his background in the Monitor branch. He didn't use a biological organic weapon to do the job. He used a low-tech method to ensure there was no viral signature that could be tracked by the BSAA. This clinical execution was designed to look like a random act of violence or a disappearance, allowing Gideon to maintain his ghost status for another decade. He viewed the removal of Alyssa as a data cleanup operation, a way to protect the 15 years of research he had conducted at Rhodes Hill. He failed to realize that by silencing the mother, he was inadvertently creating the forensic predator that would eventually find him, which is her daughter, Grace. The clinical reality of this murder is the forensic void it left behind. Gideon utilized his connections to ensure that the investigation into Alyssa's death was redacted and buried within the digital archives of the FBI. He thought he had erased the Ashcroft threat permanently. However, the trauma he inflicted on Grace Ashcroft became the very fuel that allowed her to see through the systemic lies of the 2028 world. Gideon's mistake was his belief that human emotion is an inefficiency that can be ignored. He treated the murder as a logistics entry, failing to account for the generational resolve of the Ashcroft family. This murder is the original sin of Resident Evil Requiem, the moment where the administrative villain's cold logic created the very human force that would dismantle his perfect order. Furthermore, the murder of Alyssa in 2018 allowed Gideon to finalize his control over the lost records. With the only person capable of identifying the data gone, Gideon was free to integrate the RPD archives into the Elpis project. He used Alyssa's own research as a blueprint to find the remaining survivors he needed for his final experiments. This is a profound irony in the lore. The woman who wanted to expose the monster provided him with the maps to finish his work. Gideon viewed this as a surgical victory, a way to turn a threat into an asset. He is a man who recycles everything, including the lives of those who try to stop him. The murder was the final act of the Rhodes Hill era and the beginning of the Elpis era, a clinical transition that defines the stakes of the 30th anniversary mission. Part 5. The Elpis Project, Gideon's ultimate goal. Project Elpis represents the ultimate evolution of biological warfare in the Resident Evil universe. While the Umbrella Corporation and its immediate successors focused on the creation of monsters, physical threats like the Tyrant or the Nemesis, Victor Gideon has shifted the focus entirely toward the host. The Elpis project is not designed to destroy a population, but to rewrite it. Elpis is a specialized, high-tier viral strain that targets the human nervous system and the sensory perception centers of the brain. It is a social virus designed to remove the human capacity for fear, rebellion, and independent thought. Gideon's goal is to create a world where humanity becomes a singular, compliant, and perfectly ordered organism that can be managed from a central command node. The clinical reality of Elpis is its sensory erasure capability. Those infected with the virus do not become shambling zombies. They remain high-functioning and intelligent, but they lose their individual agency. They become part of a hive mind that is dictated by the Elpis frequency emitted by Gideon's command towers. This virus is the final solution to the problem of human instability that Gideon has been studying since his days at Umbrella. He believes that the chaos of the modern world, the wars, the biological outbreaks, and the social collapses, is caused by the internal friction of human emotion. By releasing Elpis, he intends to perform a planetary sterilization of the human soul, leaving behind a compliant and efficient population that can no longer feel the pain of its own existence. Gideon views Project Elpis as an act of mercy. In his twisted logic, a world without fear and without rebellion is a paradise. He believes he is the only one with the administrative courage to perform the necessary surgery on the human genome. This is what makes Elpis more dangerous than any previous virus. It is not a weapon of war, but a tool of governance. If Gideon succeeds, the world doesn't end in a bang or a whimper. It ends in a perfectly managed silence. The virus is the requiem for human freedom, a clinical rewrite of what it means to be a person. It is the peak of the monitor philosophy, turning the entire planet into a controlled environment, where every individual is a compliant data point in a global logistics network. Furthermore, the development of Elpis utilized research from various other incidents, including the megamycete data acquired from the connections and the mold research from the Baker incident. Gideon has synthesized these disparate biological elements into a refined pathogen that is much more subtle and difficult to detect than the T virus. Elpis does not cause necrosis or rapid mutation. It causes compliance. This makes it the ultimate shadow threat. By the time the world realizes the outbreak has occurred, the population will have already lost the will to fight back. Gideon's ultimate goal is to become the administrator of the aftermath, the man who sits at the center of a silent world, finally achieving the perfect order that Umbrella failed to reach 30 years ago. Part 6. Freeing Elpis. What does it mean? In the clinical vocabulary of Victor Gideon, the phrase freeing Elpis carries a profound ideological weight that is central to the narrative of Resident Evil Requiem. To Gideon, freeing Elpis does not mean releasing a dangerous virus to cause death. It means releasing the human species from the prison of human emotion. He believes that the inherent instability of the human mind, the fear, the greed, the anger, and the desire for independence, is the primary cause of all biological and social failure in the world. By release the Elpis pathogen on a global scale, Gideon intends to free humanity from its own chaotic nature. He views himself as a liberator who is performing a necessary biological surgery to create a world of perfect order. In his view, a compliant, emotionless humanity is a saved humanity. The freeing of the virus is a planetary saturation event. Gideon has established a network of broadcast nodes that will emit a specific neural frequency once the Elpis pathogen is released into the atmosphere. This frequency will synchronize the infected population, creating a singular, compliant organism. Gideon believes that this hive mind is the only way to ensure the long-term survival of the species in a world that is permanently scarred by biological war. He views the chaos of the Raccoon City incident in 1998 as the ultimate proof that freedom is a biological hazard. By freeing Elpis, he is essentially closing the loop on human history, replacing the noise of billions of individual voices with the perfect silence of his own administrative directives. The clinical reality of freeing Elpis is the death of the individual. Gideon understands that most people will view this as a tragedy, but he views it as a logistical upgrade. He believes that the soul is an inefficiency that leads to viral friction. His ideology is a form of biological nihilism dressed as strategic necessity. He is the requiem for human agency, the villain who offers peace through infection. This makes the stakes of Resident Evil Requiem much higher than a standard survival horror game. Leon and Grace are not just fighting for their lives. They are fighting for the right to be afraid and angry. They are fighting for the right to be imperfect. Gideon's freedom is a state of eternal compliance, a clinical sterilization of the human experience. Furthermore, freeing Elpis is Gideon's attempt to correct the mistake of 1998. He believes that if Umbrella had possessed the Elpis pathogen 30 years ago, Raccoon City would have become a model of order, rather than a graveyard. He views the 2028 mission as the final deployment of the work that started in the Arklay Mountains. He is the man who has spent 30 years cleaning the mess of the past to prepare the soil for the paradise of the future. Freeing Elpis is the terminal act of his career, the moment where the administrative ghost finally becomes the governing deity of a silent world. He is the villain who doesn't want to destroy you. He wants to solve you, and that is why he must be stopped at any cost. Part 7. Why Grace's blood is the key. In the final phase of the Elpis project, Victor Gideon has identified a clinical requirement that can only be fulfilled by one individual, which is Grace Ashcroft. The key to the perfect order is not found in a laboratory, but in Grace's blood. Grace is a natural archive of the biological history of Resident Evil. Because her mother, Alyssa Ashcroft, was exposed to various viral strains, including the T virus, the G virus, and the T aerosol, during the original Raccoon City incident in 1998, Grace was born with a unique and stabilized set of legacy antibodies. These antibodies have evolved in her system for 24 years, creating a rare biological stabilizer that Gideon needs to finalize the Elpis vaccine. Without Grace's blood, the Elpis virus is 100% lethal, causing rapid neural collapse. With her blood, the virus is 100% controlling. Grace is the stabilizer that Gideon's paradise requires. He needs to harvest her legacy blood to create a neural buffer that allows the Elpis virus to rewrite the host's brain without killing the host. This turns Grace from a witness into a critical asset. Gideon's pursuit of her is not just about silencing a reporter's daughter, it is about harvesting the archive. He views her as a biological resource that belongs to him by right of his Umbrella lineage. This adds a layer of biological predation to the narrative. Grace is being hunted for the very thing that makes her a survivor, which is her mother's legacy. The blood in her veins is the only thing standing between Gideon and the total sterilization of the planet. The clinical reality of this situation is the violation of heritage. Grace's very existence is a record of the trauma her mother suffered, and now Gideon wants to use that trauma to finalize his plan for global compliance. This is a profound irony in the Resident Evil Requiem lore. The survival of the past is being used to engineer the compliance of the future. Gideon treats Grace as a laboratory animal that must be sampled to ensure the success of the project. He does not see her as a person, but as a biological bridge between the chaos of 1998 and the order of 2028. Her blood is the missing link in the Elpis chain, and Gideon will stop at nothing to extract it. Furthermore, the key status of Grace's blood explains why Gideon has not simply killed her. He needs her alive and biologically stable to harvest the antibodies correctly. This creates the cat and mouse dynamic of the game. Gideon is stalking her through the Wrenwood Hotel, attempting to break her mental fortitude before he takes her physical essence. He knows that high levels of cortisol and adrenaline can affect the viral purity of the blood, so he is playing a psychological game to ensure she is processed at the optimal moment. Grace is fighting to protect her blood, which is the only thing keeping the world from becoming a silent, compliant graveyard. She is the savior of the future because she carries the burden of the past in her very cells. Part 8. Gideon's appearance. Infected, undead, or BOW. Victor Gideon maintains a deceptively human appearance that is central to his role as the administrative villain. He does not transform into a massive misshapen monster like the bosses of the previous era. Instead, he wears tailored, high-tier suits and maintains a professional, clinical demeanor. However, beneath the fabric of his suit, Gideon is a patchwork of biological hubris. His body is a map of surgical scars, viral grafts, and neural implants that he has used to halt his own aging and enhance his intellectual capacity. He is a high-functioning biological organic weapon, a man who has utilized the Elpis pathogen and other refined viral strains to become something more than human, while retaining the mask of humanity to better manage the system. Gideon represents clinical horror. He is terrifying, not because of his claws or his teeth, but because of his biological coldness. He has sterilized his own humanity to become a more efficient administrator of the apocalypse. His movements are too precise, his skin is too pale and waxy, and his eyes reflect a lack of biological friction. He is fundamentally no longer human, but he remains rational. He is the realization of the umbrella ideal, the merging of the human mind with the viral potential of the progenitor strain without the chaos of mutation. He is the controlled outcome that Oswell Spencer and Albert Wesker failed to achieve. He is the stable god who still knows how to read a balance sheet. The clinical reality of Gideon's appearance is the horror of the uncanny. He looks like a person you would see in a high-tier boardroom or a government briefing, but there is a biological wrongness to him that Grace and Leon can feel instinctively. He represents the refined evil of the mid-2020s. He doesn't need to roar, he just needs to stare. His physical enhancements allow him to process information at a superhuman rate and survive physical trauma that would kill a normal man, but he does not mutate unless his biological integrity is fundamentally compromised. He is the requiem for the monster, a villain who has moved beyond the need for a physical, final form, because he has already achieved final authority. Furthermore, Gideon's appearance is a strategic asset. By looking human, he can continue to navigate the official world of the BSAA and the international community. He is the wolf in a tailored suit, a predator that has successfully integrated itself into the high-tier structures of the global security apparatus. He views the theatrical mutations of the past as failures of aesthetics. To Victor Gideon, true evolution is the ability to maintain one's self while possessing the power of the pathogen. He is the sovereign individual, a man who has used 30 years of biological research to turn his own body into a perfectly ordered system. His appearance is his professional mask, hiding the cold abyss of a man who has traded his soul for the Elpis ideology. Part 9. The Serial Killer. Element: plastic bags and knives. One of the most disturbing and grounded aspects of Victor Gideon's character in Resident Evil Requiem is his serial killer methodology. Despite having access to high-tier biological weapons and advanced viral pathogens, Gideon often chooses to dispose of unfit test subjects and loose ends using low-tech, intimate methods which include suffocation via plastic bags and the use of surgical knives. This is not a sign of madness, but a sign of clinical resourcefulness. Gideon views biological viral samples as high-value assets that should not be wasted on disposable materials. To him, killing a human being with a plastic bag is a cost-effective and surgical way to clean the environment. This makes him feel grounded and terrifying, in a way that a giant monster cannot achieve. This low-tech signature creates a visceral sense of primal horror. When Grace finds a room full of processed subjects in the basement of the Wrenwood Hotel, they are not mutated monsters. They are people who were simply removed through suffocation. This clinical efficiency is far more disturbing than a viral outbreak because it shows a premeditated disregard for human life. Gideon treats the act of murder like a routine housekeeping task. He uses the surgical knife with the precision of a doctor, not to heal, but to prune the inefficiencies from his project. He is a monster who is as comfortable with a blade as he is with a virus. This serial killer element highlights his operational detachment. He is a man who can look a victim in the eye and feel nothing but a desire for cleanliness. The clinical reality of this methodology is the fear of the mundane. In a world of zombies and tyrants, the threat of a man with a plastic bag is a terrifyingly real category of danger. It reminds the player that Gideon is a human predator as much as a biological one. He enjoys the control he has over his victims, viewing their struggle for breath as a biological data point on the will to live. He is the requiem for the human predator, a man who has integrated the coldness of the monitor branch into the intimacy of the kill. Grace, being a forensic analyst, is particularly affected by this, as she can read the clinical cruelty in the evidence he leaves behind. It makes Gideon personal. He isn't just a boss at the end of a level. He is a killer who has been in the room with his victims. Furthermore, the use of plastic bags and knives is a way for Gideon to avoid detection by biosensors. The BSAA and other agencies are trained to look for viral signatures, but Gideon knows how to operate under the radar. By using traditional methods of murder, he ensures that his facility remains biologically clean in the eyes of the investigators. He is the master of the invisible kill, a man who understands that the best way to hide a biological conspiracy is to keep the physical mess to a minimum. This serial killer element is what makes Victor Gideon the defining administrative villain. He is the man who manages the apocalypse with a spreadsheet and cleans up the errors with a surgical knife. He is the personification of the cold, hard truth of the Resident Evil world, which is that the most dangerous monsters are the ones who are rational. Part 10. Gideon versus classic RE villains, Wesker, Spencer, Birkin. When we perform a clinical comparison between Victor Gideon and the classic villains of the Resident Evil franchise, we see a fundamental shift in the nature of evil. Albert Wesker wanted to be a god. Oswald Spencer wanted to be immortal. William Birkin wanted to evolve. Victor Gideon wants to govern. He lacks the theatrical ego and the god complex of Wesker, which makes him far more dangerous in the long term. Gideon does not want to sit on a throne of black tentacles. He wants to sit at a desk in a perfectly ordered world. He doesn't want to kill you or turn you into a monster. He wants to own your mind. He is the administrative villain, a man who views the apocalypse not as a personal ascension, but as a necessary logistics project. Classic villains like Spencer and Birkin were driven by personal desires, the fear of death or the obsession with scientific discovery. This made them predictable and vulnerable to their own internal friction. Gideon is driven by an ideological certainty that is entirely detached from his own personal ego. He believes he is doing what is right for the human species. He has sterilized his own desires to become a more effective instrument of order. This makes him a systemic threat rather than a personal one. You cannot reason with Gideon, and you cannot exploit his ego because he has already discarded it. He is a biological bureaucrat, the man who has turned the business of extinction into a standard operating procedure. The clinical reality of this comparison is the shift in scale. Wesker and Spencer were high-profile threats that invited international intervention. Gideon is a low-profile ghost who has successfully integrated himself into the very institutions that were built to stop him. He represents the refined evil of the mid-2020s. He is the villain for an era that is tired of theatrical outbreaks and is desperate for security. Gideon offers peace through infection, making him a much more insidious opponent. He is the requiem for the theatrical villain, a man who proves that the most effective way to win a war is to convince the enemy that they have already lost. He is the judge of the 30th anniversary, the man who is finally ready to implement the final audit of the human race. Furthermore, Gideon's lack of theatricality means he does not make the classic mistakes of his predecessors. He doesn't leave complex puzzles for the heroes to solve out of a sense of superiority. He sabotages their gear and uses their trauma to liquidate their resolve. He doesn't want a final battle. He wants a successful process. This makes his encounters in Resident Evil Requiem much more stressful and psychological. He is hunting the mind of Grace and the will of Leon. He is the refinement of the Umbrella legacy, the man who took the vague evil of the Spencer era and turned it into the precise evil of the Elpis project. Gideon is the ultimate architect of the new world, a villain who actually makes sense to a world that is broken by 30 years of biological war. And that is why he is the most dangerous opponent the series has ever produced. Part 11. The shift from corporate greed to ideological control. The transition from the era of the Umbrella Corporation to the era of Victor Gideon represents a fundamental evolution in the nature of the Resident Evil antagonist. In the late 1990s, the primary driver of biological horror was corporate greed. Umbrella was a pharmaceutical giant, driven by stock prices, market dominance, and the pursuit of a biological monopoly. They viewed their viral pathogens as products to be sold to the highest bidder. However, Victor Gideon has moved beyond the business of life and has embraced the ideology of life. He does not care about money, dividends, or corporate hierarchies. Gideon is a true believer. He believes that the human species is a failed biological experiment that requires a singular administrative hand to survive. This shifts the series' stakes from stopping a company to stopping an ideology. Gideon believes he is the only person on the planet with the administrative courage to do what is necessary for humanity's long-term survival. In his view, the corporate era was messy and inefficient because it was distracted by the pursuit of wealth. To Gideon, wealth is a finite and ultimately meaningless metric. He seeks perfect order, a state of global existence where the chaotic variables of human emotion and individual agency are removed via the Elpis pathogen. This makes him a far more dangerous opponent than any CEO, because he cannot be bought, bargained with, or bankrupted. He is not motivated by the fear of losing his job. He is motivated by the certainty of his own logic. This clinical fanaticism is the hallmark of the mid-2020s villain. a man who views his crimes as a holy sterilization of a rotting world. The clinical reality of this ideological shift is seen in how Gideon manages his assets. He does not view his staff or his subjects as employees or victims, but as functional units in a global plan. If an entire laboratory must be incinerated to protect the integrity of the Elpis ideology, he will do so without hesitation. He has sterilized his own greed to become a more effective instrument of his vision. This is the requiem for the corporate villain. Gideon represents the realization that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones who want to steal your money, but the ones who want to correct your soul. He has turned the bioweapon industry into a social crusade, a clinical attempt to rewrite the human experience according to his own rigid standards of order. Furthermore, this shift in motivation makes Gideon's operations nearly impossible to dismantle through traditional means. You cannot destroy an ideology by raiding a single building. Even if the Rhodes Hill facility is destroyed, the Elpis ideology has already been seeded into the global security apparatus. Gideon has spent 20 years ensuring that his vision is self-sustaining. He has convinced high-tier officials in the BSAA and other organizations that his perfect order is the only solution to a world of permanent biological war. He is not just a man. He is the infection of an idea. The shift from greed to ideology is the definitive change in the Resident Evil landscape, proving that the real battle in the year 2028 is not over who owns the virus, but over who owns the future of the human mind. Part 12. Gideon's connection to the sterilization strategy. Victor Gideon's history is inextricably linked to the darkest chapter of the Resident Evil timeline, which is the 1998 sterilization operation. While history remembers the thermobaric strike on Raccoon City as a desperate attempt by the government to contain the T virus, the clinical reality is that Gideon was one of the primary architects behind the scenes. During his tenure as a monitor for Umbrella, he was part of the advisory board that recommended the total erasure of the city. However, his motivation was not containment. It was a data audit. Gideon viewed the nuke as a waste of material. He believed that instead of burning the city and its population to ash, the government and Umbrella should have used Raccoon City as the first live fire laboratory for a controlled sensory rewrite. Gideon's connection to the sterilization strategy defines his current worldview. He learned from the mistake of 1998 that fire is only a temporary solution to biological chaos. He believes that the incineration of the city was a failure of imagination. In his view, the sterilization should have been biological, not thermal. This is why his current project is named Elpis. He intends to perform a surgical sterilization of the human species that leaves the physical infrastructure intact while erasing the chaotic mind. He views himself as the man who is finally finishing the job that the government botched 30 years ago. He is the requiem for Raccoon City, the man who wants to turn the entire planet into a sterilized environment where the infection of emotion can no longer spread. The clinical reality of this connection is Gideon's total lack of remorse for the deaths of over 100,000 people. To him, those lives were merely biological samples that were lost due to poor management. He views the survivors like Leon Kennedy and the late Alyssa Ashcroft as loose ends of a failed operation. His work at the Rhodes Hill facility and the Wrenwood Hotel is a direct continuation of the sterilization philosophy, but refined through 3 decades of forensic analysis. He has moved from erasure by fire to erasure by Elpis. He believes that by controlling the memory and perception of the population, He can achieve a state of eternal containment that no thermobaric bomb could ever match. Furthermore, Gideon's role in the original strategy gave him access to the redacted government protocols that still govern the Arclay exclusion zone. He knows exactly where the gaps in the security grid are, because he is the one who designed them. He has used this knowledge to operate the Rhodes Hill facility for 20 years without detection. He is the man who owned the aftermath of 1998. And he is now using that ownership to engineer the aftermath of the entire human race. His connection to the sterilization strategy makes him the defining bridge villain of the series. He is the man who saw the beginning of the nightmare and decided that the only problem was that it didn't go far enough. He is the architect of a perfected sterilization, and his mission in 2028 is the final verdict on the city that was burned 30 years ago. Part 13. Why Gideon is a stalker-type enemy. In the gameplay structure of Resident Evil Requiem, Victor Gideon serves as a psychological stalker enemy. Unlike previous stalker archetypes like Mr. X or Nemesis, who relied on physical intimidation and the destruction of the environment, Gideon stalks the protagonist through the architecture of the mind. He does not just burst through walls. He leaves high-tier recordings for Grace to find, sabotages her technical forensics kit, and speaks to her directly through the hotel's intercom system. He gaslights the protagonist, attempting to break her mental fortitude before he ever makes physical contact. He is a predator of the psyche, a man who understands that in the year 2028, the most effective way to hunt a forensic analyst is to corrupt the data she relies on. Gideon's stalking is a clinical operation. He monitors Grace's heart rate, her cortisol levels, and her technical progress through the hotel's security network. He uses this information to time his interventions for maximum psychological impact. He wants Grace to be in a state of total neural fragility before he harvests her blood for the Elpis vaccine. He views the hunt as a stress test of her legacy antibodies. By speaking to her and leaving clues about her mother's final moments, he is attempting to trigger a panic state that will prime her biology for his experiments. He is a stalker in the most literal sense of the word, a man who has turned an entire building into a psychological pressure cooker to achieve a specific research objective. The clinical reality of this stalking is the erosion of safety. In Resident Evil Requiem, there are no true safe rooms from Gideon's voice. Even when Grace is behind a locked door, he can still reach her through the digital infrastructure. This creates a sense of information paranoia. The player begins to question the files they find and the directions they are given, wondering if they are being led into a trap. Gideon is the requiem for the physical stalker, a villain who proves that the most terrifying enemy is the one you can't shoot because he is already inside your head. He treats the hunt like a surgical procedure, carefully removing Grace's sense of self until she is nothing more than a compliant biological asset ready for processing. Furthermore, Gideon's stalking method allows Capcom to explore the forensic horror of the 2028 setting. Grace must use her cyber forensics kit to counter-stalk Gideon, finding the hidden nodes and transmitters he uses to monitor her. This creates a cat and mouse game of data and signal interception. Gideon is not just a threat to her life. He is a threat to her intellectual agency. He represents the administrative predator, a man who views the protagonist as a variable to be manipulated and eventually solved. His role as a stalker is the definitive statement on the Elpis ideology, showing that the real horror of the New World Order is the total loss of privacy and the constant clinical presence of the administrator. Part 14. The psychological horror. Gideon as Hunter. Victor Gideon's role as a hunter in Resident Evil Requiem is defined by his manipulation of personal trauma and the clinical exploitation of human grief. He does not hunt Grace Ashcroft for combat data or to test the lethality of a new monster. He hunts her to see how the legacy of Alyssa handles absolute despair. He is a predator of the past, utilizing the files he stole from the RPD and the records he harvested from his own memory extraction experiments to create a personalized nightmare for the protagonist. He leaves clues about Alyssa Ashcroft's final, agonizing moments in the basement of the hotel, forcing Grace to perform a forensic autopsy on her own mother's murder. This is the peak of psychological horror in the series, a move from the body horror of the past to the mind horror of the present. Gideon understands that Grace's greatest strength is her intellect, and therefore her greatest weakness is the truth. By feeding her fragmented pieces of the truth regarding her family's destruction, he is attempting to overload her nervous system. He wants her to feel the futility of her mission. He wants her to realize that the sterilization strategy she is fighting was already won 30 years ago. He is a hunter who uses despair as a pathogen. He views Grace's tears and her panic not as emotional reactions, but as biological metrics that indicate the progress of his deconstruction of her psyche. He is the requiem for the human soul, a villain who believes that the only way to achieve perfect order is to first reduce the individual to a state of total emotional bankruptcy. The clinical reality of Gideon as a hunter is his strategic cruelty. He does not kill Grace when he has the chance because he is cultivating her. He is a farmer of fear. He understands that the unique antibodies in her blood are tied to her neural stability, and he is trying to tune her biology through psychological stress. This creates a disturbing intimacy between the hunter and the prey. Grace begins to feel as though Gideon knows her better than she knows herself. This is the horror of institutional knowledge. Gideon has the files, he has the history, and he has the administrative power to rewrite her reality. He is not just hunting a person, he is hunting a legacy, and he intends to turn that legacy into the final ingredient for his global silence. Furthermore, Gideon's status as a hunter allows the game to explore the forensic aftermath of his own crimes. As Grace follows his trail through the Wrenwood Hotel, she is constantly confronted with the clinical evidence of his serial killer signature. The plastic bags and surgical knives are not just tools. They are messages designed to remind her of her own mortality. Gideon is a hunter who is as comfortable with a blade as he is with a virus, a man who enjoys the control he has over the final moments of a life. He represents the end of the road for the Resident Evil hero, a villain who has successfully moved the conflict into the most private and vulnerable corners of the human mind. Grace must survive, not just the monsters, but the architect who created them specifically to break her. Part 15. Gideon's motivation, correcting the mistake of 1998. The primary ideological driver for Victor Gideon in Resident Evil Requiem is his belief that the Raccoon City incident of 1998 was a mistake only because the Umbrella Corporation lost control of the process. In his clinical view, the T-virus and the subsequent outbreaks were successful biological events that were ruined by poor administrative execution. He does not view the destruction of the city as a tragedy, but as a wasted opportunity for a global sterilization. Gideon believes that the world has spent 30 years in a state of biological chaos because no one has had the courage to implement a singular controlled order. His mission in 2028 is to correct history by successfully deploying a controlled outbreak via the Elpis pathogen that doesn't collapse into chaos, but into a new, rigid world order. Gideon views himself as the true administrator of the Spencer legacy. He believes that the original Umbrella founders were too theatrical and emotional to see the project through to its logical conclusion. He views the sterilization strategy, the nuke, as a clumsy and inefficient tool. To Gideon, a corrected version of 1998 would have involved the neural saturation of the population rather than their incineration. He intends to use the Arclay exclusion zone as the ground zero for this correction. He is the requiem for the Umbrella failure, the man who intends to prove that biological governance is the only sustainable future for the human species. His motivation is a form of high-tier arrogance that views the entire planet as a broken system that only he can fix. The clinical reality of this motivation is the industrialization of genocide. Gideon does not want to kill for the sake of killing. He wants to prune the species to make it more compliant. He views the freeing of Elpis as the ultimate corrective action. This makes him a far more terrifying opponent than a mad scientist because his plan is rooted in logic and efficiency. He has spent 30 years cleaning the mess of the past to prepare the soil for his new world order. He is a man who thinks in decades rather than days. Grace and Leon are, in his view, merely obstacles to progress, relics of a world that is too messy and human to survive in the new biological reality. Furthermore, Gideon's desire to correct the mistake of 1998 provides the narrative justification for the return to the Raccoon City ruins. He is drawn back to the site of the failure to perform his final act of administrative redemption. He believes that by succeeding where Umbrella failed, he will finally lay the ghosts of the past to rest. He is the monitor who never stopped working, the man who has spent a quarter of a century refining his sterilization strategy into a social ideology. Gideon is the ultimate architect of the aftermath, and his motivation is a clinical reminder that the most dangerous monsters are the ones who believe they are doing the world a favor. He is the judge of the 30th anniversary, and his verdict is that the human race is a mistake that requires a corrective rewrite. Part 16. How Gideon challenges Leon and Grace differently. Victor Gideon is a multifaceted antagonist who understands the unique psychological and tactical profiles of his opponents. In Resident Evil Requiem, he segments his challenge to Leon Kennedy and Grace Ashcroft with clinical precision. To Leon, Gideon is a ghost of Umbrella that needs to be exorcised with fire and lead. Gideon exploits Leon's extreme burnout and his moral exhaustion, attempting to convince the veteran that the war is already over and that perfect order is the only way to stop the constant cycle of biological death. He treats Leon as an obsolete unit, a relic of the 1990s who is no longer relevant in a world of ideological saturation. He challenges Leon's will to fight, using the failures of the past 30 years to erode his resolve. To Grace Ashcroft, Gideon is a family murderer and an intellectual predator. He treats the forensic analyst as a high-value biological asset that needs to be processed. He challenges her inexperience and her fragility, utilizing the environment of the Wrenwood Hotel to trap her in psychological puzzles. He gaslights her through the technical systems she relies on, sabotaging her forensics kit to make her feel powerless in the face of his administrative authority. He challenges her mind, attempting to break her sense of self before he harvests her blood. Gideon understands that while Leon is a threat to his infrastructure, Grace is a threat to his ideology. he forces them to fight two different versions of the same man, which are the tactical villain for Leon and the psychological villain for Grace. The clinical reality of this dual challenge is the fracturing of the protagonists' cooperation. By putting them through different categories of horror, Gideon attempts to separate the brain from the brawn. He knows that if Leon and Grace work together, their functional symmetry is a threat to the Elpis project. He utilizes the lost records of the RPD to distract Leon with his own past, while utilizing the trauma of Alyssa to paralyze Grace with her own grief. This is a masterclass in divide and conquer strategy. Gideon is the requiem for the hero duo, a villain who realizes that the best way to win a war is to make the heroes fight their own personal ghosts instead of him. Furthermore, Gideon's dual challenge highlights the generational gap in the Resident Evil world. He forces Leon to confront the uselessness of his combat skills against a social virus, while forcing Grace to confront the weight of a history she was too young to understand. He is the administrative judge who has performed a tactical audit of both characters. He knows their heart rates, their cortisol levels, and their breaking points. By challenging them differently, he ensures that neither can find a moment of peace or safety. He is the hunter of the aftermath, a villain who has successfully moved the series into a state of permanent crisis, where the only escape is compliance with his perfect order. Part 17. The Rhodes Hill Experiments. What happened there? Under the clinical management of Victor Gideon, the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center became a memory harvester that far surpassed the traditional biological research of the Umbrella era. Gideon utilized high-tier research data acquired from the connections, specifically the megamycete and mold studies, to develop a neural extraction protocol. His goal was to extract the consciousness and trauma of Raccoon City survivors, to better understand how the human mind reacts to biological catastrophe. The monsters found in the basements of Rhodes Hill are the failed shells of these experiments, human beings whose memories and individual identities were literally sucked out of them, leaving behind mindless biomass that reacts only to the Elpis frequency. The clinical reality of the Rhodes Hill experiments was a total sterilization of the soul. Gideon was not interested in the physical mutations caused by the virus. He was interested in the digital residue of the human experience. He viewed the survivors of 1998 as living archives that held the key to his perfect order. He used the Rhodes Hill facility to deconstruct these people, harvesting their memories to tune the Elpis pathogen. The memory extraction was an agonizing and terminal procedure that resulted in the complete neural collapse of the subject. Gideon viewed this as a surgical necessity, a way to turn the chaotic past into the structured future. He is the requiem for the human identity, the man who turned a medical facility into a neural slaughterhouse. Furthermore, Rhodes Hill served as the test site for the Elpis vaccine prototypes. Gideon used the extracted neural data to build a neural buffer that would protect the administrator himself from the mind-numbing effects of the global saturation. This is what allowed him to become a high-functioning BOW, while retaining his rational intellect. The monsters in the basement are the records of his failures, a biological waste product that he treats with a clinical indifference. He has sterilized his own guilt by viewing the subjects as incompatible data units. The sorrow of Rhodes Hill is the realization that the people who survived the 1998 city strike were merely recycled into a new nightmare by the man who was supposed to be treating them. The legacy of Rhodes Hill is the digitalization of horror. It marks the point where Resident Evil moved away from infection of the body and toward infection of the memory. Gideon has successfully turned the human mind into a resource to be harvested and refiled. The facility was the womb of the 2028 project, the place where the administrative villain proved that the most effective way to control a population is to first steal their history. As Grace Ashcroft audits the files of Rhodes Hill, she realizes that her mother was not just murdered, but was likely a target for this neural extraction. Gideon is a memory predator, a man who views the human experience as a security risk that must be neutralized through the ELPIS ideology. Part 18. Gideon's role in the 30-year timeline. Victor Gideon is the thread that binds the entire Resident Evil timeline into a single, cohesive clinical history. He is the character who bridges the gap between the 1998 Raccoon City lore and the modern bioterror era of the 2020s. While other villains like Albert Wesker or Mother Miranda were focused on their localized gothic or transhuman projects, Gideon was the administrator who was always in the background, auditing the aftermath of every incident. He is the one who took the vague evil of the Umbrella Corporation, the messy, chaotic, and often accidental leaks, and turned it into the precise evil of Project Elpis. He is the monitor of the series' history, the man who has spent 30 years cleaning the mess of the past to prepare the ground for a controlled future. Gideon's role in the timeline is to serve as the forensic anchor. He provides the institutional memory that justifies the return to the Arklay ruins. He is the reason why the lost records of the RPD still exist, and why the sterilization strategy has mutated into a global ideology. He represents the enduring logic of the bioweapon industry. Umbrella may have died, Tricell may have collapsed, and Neo Umbrella may have failed, but the administrative ghost of Gideon remained active. He is the requiem for the franchise's past, a character who proves that the original sin of 1998 was never truly exorcised. He has spent a quarter of a century refining the pathogen until it reached the perfect state of the Elpis strain. The clinical reality of Gideon's role is the integration of all pathogens. In Resident Evil Requiem, we see that Gideon has studied the T virus, the G virus, the Las Plagas, the C virus, and the mold. He has synthesized the best elements of each, specifically the hive mind of the Plagas and the neural persistence of the mold, to create Elpis. He is the curator of the apocalypse, a man who has successfully turned 30 years of human suffering into a global service model. He is the villain who actually learned from every previous failure. This makes him the final audit of the series. He is the man who has finally solved the problem of biological chaos, and his perfect order is the ultimate legacy of the 30-year timeline. Furthermore, Gideon's status as a thread makes him the perfect antagonist for the 30th anniversary. He is a villain who can speak to Leon Kennedy about the RPD and to Grace Ashcroft about her mother's investigative reporter career with equal authority. He is the librarian of the nightmare, the man who holds the keys to everyone's past. He ensures that the return to Raccoon City is not just a nostalgia trip, but a surgical confrontation with the entire history of the franchise. Gideon is the judge who has been watching the heroes for 30 years, and his verdict is that the world is too broken to be allowed to continue in its current form. He is the thread that connects the analog terror of the 1990s to the digital ideology of the mid-2020s, proving that the nightmare is a single, continuous history of human hubris. Part 19. Is Gideon working alone or with the BSAA? One of the most insidious layers of Victor Gideon's power in Resident Evil Requiem is his contractual ties to the corrupted elements of the BSAA. While he operates his own sovereign facility at Rhodes Hill, he is not a rogue scientist in the traditional sense. Gideon has successfully turned the BSAA from defenders of humanity into customers of the apocalypse. He provides shadow factions within the organization with clean bio soldiers and refined combat data in exchange for political protection and administrative clearance. He is the man who owned the aftermath of the Romania incident, utilizing the confusion within the BSAA to infiltrate their highest tiers of command. He is not working against the system. He is working as the system. The clinical reality of this partnership is the total institutional capture. Gideon has convinced certain leaders within the BSAA that the only way to combat permanent biological war is to utilize his ELPIS technology to create a compliant and controlled global population. He has turned the defenders into administrators. This makes Leon Kennedy's mission even more complex, as he realizes that the strike teams sent to the Wrenwood Hotel might actually be there to protect Gideon rather than stop him. Gideon is the requiem for institutional trust, a villain who proves that the most dangerous enemy is the one who has a signed contract with your own government. He has sterilized the moral compass of the BSAA, turning it into a paramilitary arm of the ELPIS ideology. Furthermore, this connection allows Gideon to hide in plain sight. His research at Rhodes Hill is protected by government seal, and any investigation into his activities is immediately shut down by high-tier, redacted orders. He is a legalized predator. This is the evolution of the Umbrella model. Umbrella had to pay for its own security. Gideon has successfully tricked the world's governments into paying for his. This strategic parasitism is what makes him the defining villain of the 2028 era. He is the man who realized that you don't need to defeat the army if you can become the person who gives the army its orders. He is the administrator of a corrupt world, and his ties to the BSAA are the armor that protects his perfect order. Ultimately, the question of whether Gideon is working alone is irrelevant. He is part of a global feedback loop of biological terror and institutional response. He provides the problem, the ELPIS virus, and the solution, the ELPIS compliance, and the corrupted BSAA facilitates the implementation. This is the clinical closure of the Resident Evil world, a state where the good guys and the bad guys are part of the same logistics network. Gideon is the anchor of this network, the man who has turned the apocalypse into a sustainable industry. His relationship with the BSAA is the final proof that the world is too broken to be fixed through traditional heroism. Grace and Leon are fighting a system, and Gideon is the CEO of that system's final terminal. Part 20. Final verdict. Gideon as a defining RE villain. The final verdict on Victor Gideon is that he represents the ultimate architect of the new world. He is terrifying because his plan for perfect order actually makes a distorted category of sense to a world that is exhausted by 30 years of biological war. After 3 decades of accidental leaks, corporate greed, and global outbreaks, the world of Resident Evil is in a state of permanent crisis. Gideon offers peace through infection, a clinical sterilization of the human instability that caused the chaos in the first place. He is the villain who has outgrown the need for theatricality, godhood, or immortality. He is the administrative finality of the franchise, a man who views the human race as a system error that can only be solved through the ELPIS ideology. Gideon is a defining villain because he is the first to truly succeed in bridging the gap between the corporate past and the ideological future. He has audited the failures of Spencer, Birkin, Wesker, and Simmons, and has refined their work into a single, precise evil. He is the requiem for the old world of Resident Evil. He represents the refinement of the horror, moving it away from the gross-out mutations and toward the mind-breaking neural control. He is the most dangerous opponent Leon Kennedy and Grace Ashcroft have ever faced, because he is not fighting for himself. He is fighting for a vision. He is a rational predator, a man who has sterilized his own humanity to become the perfect manager of a silent world. The clinical reality of Gideon's legacy is the permanence of the aftermath. Even if he is defeated at the Wrenwood Hotel, the Elpis ideology and the lost records he uncovered have already changed the world forever. He has declassified the truth in a way that ensures the war will never truly be the same. He is the judge of the 30th anniversary, the man who has performed the final audit of the human soul and found it wanting. He represents the institutional horror of the 2028 world state, a place where the villains are administrators and the apocalypse is a standard operating procedure. Victor Gideon is the logical conclusion of the Resident Evil timeline, the man who turned the biohazard into a global governance model. Ultimately, Victor Gideon is the architect of silence. He is the villain who wants to take away the pain of being human by taking away the freedom of being human. He is the final verdict on the 30-year history of the series, a reminder that the most terrifying nightmares are the ones that are efficient and compliant. He is the man who saw the beginning of the end in 1998 and decided to turn it into a new beginning. Victor Gideon is the definitive Resident Evil villain for the modern age, a clinical ghost who has successfully solved the world by erasing the soul of the people who live in it. His requiem is for humanity, and his order is the ultimate horror.